The modern wrecker had enough power to tear the stranded truck apart, but it couldn't pull it 6 feet. The diesel roared. The winch cable went tight, and instead of climbing toward the road, the truck slid closer to the ravine. "Back off." The operator killed the pull. Mud collapsed beneath one rear tire. 2 more feet, and 10 tons of truck would be gone down the washout. Then they heard another engine. Slow, heavy, almost 79 years old. A faded 1947 Diamond T rolled around the bend. Someone laughed. The old man behind the wheel didn't. He stepped down, walked past both trucks, and stared at the mud. Not the engines, not the winches. The mud. For almost a full minute, he said nothing. Then he looked at the modern operator. "You've got more than enough power." The operator stared at him. "Then why won't it move?" The old man pointed at the buried rear wheel. "Because you're trying to pull the whole truck." Then he pointed 6 inches uphill. "Before you freed the part that's actually holding it." He opened an old steel toolbox. Inside was a scarred red pulley his father had taught him to use when he was 16. It wouldn't make the Diamond T stronger. It wouldn't make the stranded truck lighter. And his first attempt with it would still fail. But that failure would move the truck just 6 inches. 6 inches. That would show him exactly what the modern wrecker had been fighting wrong. Before dark, the old Diamond T would move the trapped corner. The modern wrecker would finish the recovery. And everyone on that road would understand why the strongest machine there had never been the real answer. By 3:30 that afternoon, the rain had turned Miller Creek Road into something closer to wet clay than gravel. The truck had gone off the shoulder less than an hour earlier. It was a loaded farm hauler, heavy through the rear axle, with its passenger side wheels buried nearly to the hubs and the back end hanging dangerously close to a washed-out drainage cut. Every few minutes, water ran beneath the tires and carried another thin sheet of dirt downhill. Nobody standing there needed to be told what would happen if the ground gave way. That was why people relaxed when the modern heavy wrecker arrived. It looked like the answer. A tall diesel engine idled beneath a polished hood. Hydraulic outriggers dropped toward the road. Work lights came on even though the sun was still up. The recovery operator climbed down wearing clean gloves, walked around the stranded truck once, and began rigging. He had done this before, and judging by the machine behind him, he had more than enough truck for the job. The first pull looked almost effortless. At least for the first second, the winch tightened. The stranded truck rocked, then stopped. The operator added throttle. The cable drew straight as a rifle barrel. The wrecker's engine deepened into a hard mechanical growl, and for a moment everyone expected the buried tires to climb out of the rut. Instead, the wrecker moved. Not much, maybe 3 inches, but it moved in the wrong direction. Its rear tires slid across the wet gravel, carving 2 dark marks toward the ditch. The operator released the winch. Nobody laughed. He repositioned. Tried again. More throttle this time. The result was worse. The stranded truck twisted slightly downhill, and one of the men near the shoulder jumped back as a slab of mud broke loose and disappeared into the drainage cut. "That's enough," somebody said. The operator stepped away from the controls and stared at the truck. He wasn't beaten, but for the first time, he looked uncertain. Then everyone heard another engine coming up the road. Not the sharp rattle of a modern diesel. Something slower, deeper, a rhythm with long gaps between shifts. Around the bend came a faded Diamond T, its paint dulled by decades of weather, its steel body carrying scars that no restoration shop had bothered to hide. Someone near the fence laughed. "You've got to be kidding." The old truck rolled to a stop behind the modern wrecker. Its driver shut off the engine and climbed down. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't ask how much horsepower the new truck made. He didn't even walk toward the winch. He walked straight past the stranded truck, crouched at the edge of the road, and pressed the heel of his boot into the mud. Then he moved 6 feet to the left and did it again. The modern operator watched him. "What are you looking for?" The old man stood slowly. He looked at the buried rear axle, then at the slope, then at the straight line the modern cable had cut through the rain. "I'm trying to find out," he said, "what you're actually fighting." And that was the first moment anyone there realized the old man wasn't studying the truck. He was studying the ground. On paper, there was no contest. The modern wrecker was heavier, stronger, faster. Its diesel made more power than Walter's Diamond T could have imagined when it left the factory in 1947. It had hydraulic controls, better brakes, modern recovery equipment, and a winch built for work exactly like this. The Diamond T had none of that. Its faded hood stretched forward like an old locomotive. The cab was narrow. The steering was heavy. The gearbox demanded patience. When the engine settled into idle, the whole truck trembled. One of the younger men near the fence looked from the old truck to the modern wrecker. "How much power does that thing even make?" Walter didn't answer. He was watching the road. He walked to one of the modern wrecker's rear tires and scraped wet clay from the tread with his boot. Then he pressed his heel into the gravel behind it. The surface moved. Water rose immediately around the mark. Jake watched him. "You worried about my traction?" Walter crouched and pushed 2 fingers through the top layer. Loose gravel. Then slick clay underneath. "I'm worried about what happens when you ask for more of it." Jake folded his arms. "My truck has more than enough winch." "I know." That answer caught him off guard. Walter stood. He looked at the modern wrecker. "You've got plenty of truck." Then at the stranded hauler. "And plenty of pull." Jake frowned. "Then what exactly are we missing?" Walter pointed to the tire marks behind the wrecker. 3 inches of movement. Almost nothing. But in the wrong direction. The ground has to hold your truck before your truck can move his. Jake looked down. The answer was obvious once Walter said it. Every extra pound of tension in the cable demanded something from the road beneath the wrecker. Grip. Resistance. A place for the force to go. And the rain was slowly taking all 3 away. Walter walked toward the stranded truck. The recovery line ran almost perfectly straight between the 2 machines. Clean. Short. Logical. That was exactly what bothered him. He crouched beside the buried rear wheel. The passenger side had dropped lower than the driver's side. Mud was packed hard ahead of the tread. Water was cutting a shallow channel toward the washout. Walter looked from the wheel to the cable. Then back again. Jake came beside him. "You think the connection's wrong?" "No." "The line?" Walter looked along it. "Straight as you could ask for." Jake spread his hands. "So?" Walter didn't answer. "Not yet." He walked back toward the Diamond T and opened the driver's door. Behind the seat sat a battered notebook. The cover was dark with oil and worn soft at the edges. Walter held it for a moment before opening it. His father's handwriting still looked the same. Hard pencil strokes. Short notes. No wasted words. For 30 years after Harold died, Walter had kept that notebook behind the same seat. Some pages smelled faintly of grease. Others were stained by rain from jobs Walter could no longer remember. But he still recognized every line his father had drawn. Cable paths. Arrows. Loads. Trees. Ditches. Rough little diagrams made by a man who had never cared much about horsepower figures. Jake stepped closer. "What's that?" Walter turned one page. A crude sketch showed a truck pulling directly against a load. Beside it was another drawing. Same truck. Same load. Different line. At the bottom, Harold had written one sentence. Walter read it silently. For a second, he could almost hear his father saying it. Jake waited. Walter closed the notebook. "Something my father made me learn the hard way." "What?" Walter looked toward the modern wrecker, then toward the buried truck. Strongest machine on the road can still lose. If you ask the force to go somewhere, the load can't. Jake followed his eyes toward the rut. For the first time, he was no longer looking only at the stranded truck. He was looking at the ground around it. The slope, the buried rear corner, the straight cable, the disappearing shoulder. Walter tucked the notebook under one arm. Everyone else had spent the afternoon asking the same question. How much force would it take? Walter had begun with another. What was actually holding the truck? And now a second question mattered even more. If straight was making it worse, where should the force go instead? The Diamond T had belonged to Walter's father. Not when it was new. Harold Hayes bought it after somebody else had already worked the shine out of it. The paint was faded. The seat was split. One front fender carried a dent that stayed there for the rest of Harold's life. Walter used to ask why he never fixed it. Harold always gave the same answer. "Dent still working?" Walter would stare at him. "What? Truck still working?" "Yes." "Then we've got more important things." Walter hated that answer when he was young. At 16, he hated almost everything about the Diamond T. Other trucks were faster, quieter, easier to drive. The Diamond T made every mile feel like labor. The steering wheel kicked against your palms on bad ground. The gearbox punished anyone who tried to hurry it. The brakes demanded that you think about stopping long before you wanted to stop. And the old winch behind the cab made a mechanical whine. Walter could feel through the floorboards. One afternoon, after spending half the day helping Harold recover a hay truck from a creek crossing, Walter finally asked, "Why don't we buy something stronger?" Harold looked over from the driver's seat. "Stronger than what?" "This." Walter slapped the dashboard. "A newer truck. Bigger engine. More power." Harold studied him for a moment, then smiled. Not because Walter was wrong, because Harold had once believed exactly the same thing. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a red Snatch block. The thing was heavier than Walter expected. Harold handed it over. Walter nearly dropped it. "What does this have to do with horsepower?" "Nothing." Walter frowned. Harold took the block back. "That's the point." They climbed out. Harold found a stick and drew 2 lines in the dirt. One ran straight from a truck to a load. The other bent around an imaginary anchor before reaching the same load. "Engine gives you force," Harold said. He tapped the first line. "But force only follows where you send it. Then the second, you get to decide that part." Walter stared at the drawings. "So the pulley makes the truck stronger?" Harold shook his head. "You're still asking the wrong question." He pointed toward the load. "Don't start with how much power you've got. Then toward the ground beneath it. Start with what's keeping that thing from moving." Walter did not understand. Not really. Not that day. But Harold kept making him look. At tractors buried in creek bottoms, hay trucks stuck sideways on frozen grades, farm wagons sunk to their axles after spring rain. Harold never walked straight to the winch. He walked the ground first, pressed his boot into the soil, studied tire marks, looked at slopes, asked which wheel would move first and which one was carrying the problem. Sometimes men grew impatient. Sometimes they laughed. Walter had laughed too, until enough recoveries ended the same way. The men who had wanted more power watched Harold use less of it. Years later, Walter finally understood why. Harold had never been trying to prove the Diamond T was stronger than anything else. He had been trying to avoid making strength do work that judgment could do first. When Harold died, Walter left the truck in the barn. For nearly a month, he barely touched it. The first time he finally opened the driver's door, his father's work gloves were still lying beneath the seat. Walter sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. One glove had folded inward at the fingers, almost like a hand had just been pulled from it. Walter picked it up, held it for a long time, then put it back exactly where he had found it. He sold the gloves eventually. He almost sold the Diamond T twice. Both times, buyers came with money. Both times, Walter walked them around the truck, showed them the engine, the dents, the old recovery gear, and both times, when the men left, the Diamond T was still sitting in the barn. Walter told himself it was because the truck remained useful. That was only partly true. The deeper truth was harder to admit. Every lever inside that cab still reminded him how Harold's hands had moved. Every scratch in the toolbox belonged to a job Walter had once watched his father solve, and beneath a coil of old chain sat the same red Snatch block. Years passed. Harold's voice became harder to remember. The tools did not. Back on Miller Creek Road, Walter opened the toolbox. His hand stopped on the block. For just a second, the rain disappeared. He remembered 16-year-old hands struggling with its weight. His father's boots in the dirt, 2 lines scratched beside a road that no longer existed. Then Jake's voice brought him back. "You really think that old thing is going to make a difference?" Walter lifted the block. Rain struck the scarred red steel. He looked at Jake. then toward the stranded truck. No. Jake raised an eyebrow. Walter turned the block once in his hands. Not by itself. He looked toward the straight recovery line, then toward the buried rear corner, then at the road shoulder already beginning to give way beneath Jake's wrecker. Jake followed his gaze. Walter saw something in the younger man he recognized immediately. Not arrogance. Certainty. The kind Walter himself had carried at 16, enough experience to trust what he knew, not yet enough to distrust what the ground was telling him. Walter almost smiled. Harold would have recognized it too. Jake pointed toward the block. So what does it give us? Walter looked at the mud. A different question. What question? Walter pointed toward the trapped rear wheel. Not how hard can we pull it. Then he pointed slightly uphill. How little does that corner need to move before the whole job changes? Jake stared at the truck. Behind them, thunder rolled through the trees. The road shoulder softened another fraction beneath the rain. Walter closed his hand around the red block. For 60 years, the lesson had lived inside that piece of iron. Now they were about to find out whether he had actually learned it. The modern operator wasn't convinced, and to be fair, he had no reason to be. His truck was built for exactly this kind of work. It had recovered loaded semis from icy shoulders, pulled dump trucks out of construction pits, lifted broken tractors off embankments. He knew his machine. He knew what it could do. And right now, the answer still seemed simple. More pull. He walked back to the controls. Everybody clear. The old man said nothing. He stepped away from the cable and watched. The operator reset the winch. The line tightened. The stranded truck settled against the mud. Then the diesel climbed. The sound filled the narrow road. A deep, violent roar. The cable pulled straight. The rear of the stranded truck lifted less than an inch, then dropped again. The operator increased power. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The wrecker, the cable, the truck, even the men watching from the fence. Then the mud beneath the stranded truck began to move. Not backward, down. The rear tire nearest the ravine sank deeper into the rut. Water squeezed out around it. The truck leaned another degree toward the drainage cut. Stop! The operator released the winch. The engine fell back to idle. Nobody spoke. The old man walked toward the stranded truck. He crouched near the buried wheel. A fresh ridge of mud had formed ahead of the tire. He touched it, then looked at the cable. The pull had been strong enough to move something, but not the thing they wanted. The operator climbed down. What now? The old man pointed at the rear tire. See that? I say mud. No. Look at the shape. The operator came closer. The tire wasn't simply buried. It had pushed a wall of wet clay ahead of itself. Every straight pull was trying to drag the tire through that wall. At the same time, the truck's rear corner was trapped lower than the front. The line from the wrecker was pulling forward, but part of that force was pressing the buried side into the ground. The old man drew a line in the mud with his boot. Your truck is pulling this way. Then he drew another line downhill. But the load wants to move this way first. The operator stared at the two lines. So you're asking one pull to do 3 jobs. The old man pointed at the axle. Break the wheel loose. Then at the rear of the truck, lift this corner, then toward the road, and drag the whole load forward. He looked back at the modern wrecker. That machine has enough power for all 3. The operator crossed his arms. Then what's the problem? The old man looked at the tire marks behind the wrecker. The ground doesn't? The answer hung there. The modern truck could generate more force than the road could hold. That was the part nobody had considered. Every extra bit of throttle increased tension in the cable. But it also demanded more traction from the recovery truck, more grip from wet gravel, more resistance from mud already turning slick beneath the tires. The operator looked down at his own rear wheels. The tread blocks were packed almost smooth with clay. The old man walked several steps uphill. He stopped where the road narrowed beside an old fence line. The ground there was different. Higher, firmer, gravel, mixed with exposed stone. He pressed his heel into it. This time, it barely sank. Then he looked across the ditch. A thick cottonwood stood beyond the washed-out shoulder. The operator followed his eyes. "You're thinking about anchoring?" The old man didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he walked back toward the Diamond T. The red Snatch block was still sitting on the running board. He picked it up. The modern operator finally smiled. "You've been waiting to use that thing all afternoon." The old man shook his head. "No." He looked once more at the 2 lines he'd drawn in the mud. "I've been waiting to know where to put it." For the first time that afternoon, the problem had changed. It was no longer, how hard could they pull? It was, what if they stopped pulling in a straight line? The old man left the Diamond T where it was. That confused everyone. If he really believed the old truck could help, they expected him to start rigging. Instead, he walked away from both wreckers. 20 feet uphill, then 30. He stopped near the fence line and looked back at the scene. From there, the problem looked different. The stranded truck wasn't simply stuck. It was twisted. Its front axle sat higher on the road. The rear axle had dropped into softer ground. The passenger side tires were deeper than the driver's side, and the entire truck was resting at an angle that made every straight pull force part of its weight harder into the ditch. The old man narrowed his eyes. Then he started walking again. He stepped into the ruts left by the modern wrecker, pressed his heel down, moved 2 feet, pressed again. The first spot was slick, the second was soft. The third barely moved beneath him. The modern operator finally followed. "You looking for a place to park?" The old man shook his head. "I'm looking for what stays put." He walked toward the stranded truck. This time, he didn't look at the cab. He looked underneath. Mud had packed behind one rear tire. The axle housing sat close to the edge of the rut. A length of bent grass showed where the truck had first slid sideways before dropping. He traced that path with his eyes. The operator watched him. "What does that tell you? That it didn't go in straight?" So it probably doesn't want to come out straight either." The old man took a few steps back. He lifted one hand and pointed toward the truck. "First movement won't be forward." He moved his finger slightly uphill. "It'll be here." Then he rotated his hand. "Then it can come around." The operator studied the truck again. This time longer. The old man could see the moment he began to understand. A recovery wasn't always about dragging a load from point A to point B. Sometimes the first job was to change the position of the load. Break one wheel free. Rotate an axle. Take weight off one corner. Reduce the resistance before demanding more force. The old man picked up a stick and pushed it into the mud beside the buried tire. Then he pushed another into firmer ground, 3 feet away. "Same truck," he said. "Same weight." He tapped the first stick. "But from here, it fights you." Then the second. "From here, maybe it helps you." The operator frowned. "A truck doesn't help." "No." The old man looked at the slope. "But gravity can." Then he walked toward the cottonwood across the drainage cut. Not close enough to touch it. Just close enough to study the trunk. The roots. And the ground around it. He looked back toward the Diamond T. Then toward the stranded truck. Then at the red Snatch block in his hand. The operator called after him. "You've got a plan now?" The old man turned. "Almost." "What's missing?" He looked at the stranded truck one more time. "I need to know what moves first." The operator laughed once. Quietly. "You've said that 3 times. The old man nodded. "Because that's the part everybody skips." He walked back to the buried wheel and crouched beside it. Then he placed his hand against the sidewall. People see 10 tons of truck and think they have to move 10 tons. He looked up. "You don't." He tapped the tire. "You only have to move the part that's keeping the rest from moving." For the first time, the modern operator said nothing. The old man stood. Behind them, the rain began hitting the steel bodies of both wreckers harder. Time was getting shorter. But the old man wasn't watching the sky. He was watching one buried wheel, because he finally knew where the recovery had to begin. Walter carried the red Snatch block back toward the Diamond T. By then, nobody was laughing. Not because they believed the old truck could outpull the modern wrecker. It couldn't. They were beginning to understand that Walter was solving a different problem. Jake followed him. "You keep carrying that thing around like it's the answer." Walter set the block on the running board. It isn't. Jake frowned. Then what is? Walter looked toward the stranded truck. The first movement. Jake followed his eyes. The hauler sat twisted toward the washout. One rear corner buried deeper than the rest. Rainwater ran beneath the passenger side tire. Jake pointed toward it. I know where I want the truck to end up. That's not what I asked. Walter picked up the battered notebook from behind the seat. He opened to a page filled with his father's pencil marks. A truck. A load. A straight line between them. Beside it, another drawing. Same truck. Same load. But the line approached from a different direction. Beneath it, Harold had written 4 words. Power follows the line. Walter ran his thumb across the faded letters. For a moment, he remembered being 16, standing beside his father, still convinced that every hard job needed a bigger engine. Jake leaned closer. What does that mean? Walter closed the notebook. Your engine doesn't know what that truck needs. Jake gave him a look. Obviously. Neither does your winch. Walter pointed toward the stranded hauler. They make force. Then toward the ground. We decide what the force asks the load to do. Jake looked back at the ditch. The straight pull from earlier had tried to solve everything at once. Free the buried tire. Raise the low rear corner. Rotate the truck away from the ravine. Then drag 10 tons toward the road. Walter pointed at the trapped rear wheel. I don't need the whole truck to come home yet. He moved his hand a few inches uphill. I need that corner to move first. Jake studied the angle. And after that, we look again. Jake almost laughed. That's the plan? That's always the plan. Walter lifted the red block. Jake looked from the tool to the diamond T. So you're saying this old truck can do something mine can't? Walter answered immediately. No. Jake paused. Walter pointed toward the modern wrecker. Your truck is stronger. Then rested one hand on the faded diamond T. Better brakes. Better controls. More winch. Jake raised an eyebrow. Then why are we using yours? Walter looked toward the patch of firmer ground he had found uphill. Because right now, I don't need the strongest truck. He looked at the trapped rear corner. I need a truck in the right place. Asking for the right movement. That silenced Jake. Walter picked up the block again. The paint was nearly gone from one side. A long scar crossed the steel. His father had made that mark decades earlier. Walter used to think old tools survived because men were too poor or too stubborn to replace them. Now he knew better. Some survived because they taught the same lesson every time you picked them up. The tool did not know the answer. It only gave you another way to ask the question. Walter walked toward the firmer section of road. Jake followed. They studied the ground again. Then the slope. Then the buried wheel. Walter showed Jake the new cable path only in broad terms. The diamond T would remain on firmer footing. The pull would approach the trapped corner from farther uphill. Not enough to drag the entire hauler toward the road. Only enough to see whether the rear corner would rotate away from the mud wall. Jake looked at the setup. So, this is a test. Walter nodded. Everything before the final pull is a test. And if it doesn't work, we stop. And if it moves, we stop then too. Jake frowned. Walter looked at him. Movement is information. Rain tapped harder against the diamond T's hood. The men near the fence backed farther away. Walter climbed into the cab. For an instant, his hand rested on the old steering wheel. The surface had been polished smooth by decades of use. His father's hands had worn part of that shine into it. Walter tightened his grip. Then the memory was gone. He started the truck. The old engine settled into its slow mechanical rhythm. Nothing about the sound suggested enormous power. That was fine. Walter was not asking for enormous power. He was asking for 6 inches. Jake stood where he could see both the recovery truck and the buried rear wheel. Walter took up the load slowly. The line straightened. The red block came under tension. The stranded truck trembled. Nothing moved. Walter waited. Jake watched the wheel. Then, the buried rear tire shifted. Barely. The mud wall cracked. The rear corner rotated uphill. 2 inches. Then 4. A thin gap opened behind the tread. Someone near the fence shouted. Walter did not react. The truck moved again. 6 inches. Then something changed beneath the diamond T. Walter felt it through the seat before anyone saw it. A soft movement. Not the load. His own truck. He released the pull immediately. The line relaxed. Silence returned to the road. Jake stared at the stranded truck. It had moved. Not much, but enough to prove Walter's idea. Then Jake looked behind the diamond T. One rear tire had pressed slightly deeper into the wet shoulder. You felt that? Walter climbed down. Yes. Jake looked disappointed. Walter wasn't. He walked toward the 6-inch mark beside the buried tire, then back toward the fresh track behind the diamond T. 2 movements. 2 answers. Jake came beside him. That's it? Walter crouched near the rut. For this pull, he pointed toward the stranded truck. That 6 inches told us where the load is willing to move. Then toward the diamond T. And that mark told us where I'm not willing to keep pulling from. Jake looked between them. You're smiling. Walter stood. He hadn't realized he was. For a second, he heard Harold's voice from 60 years earlier, not telling him what would work, telling him to look at what the first pull had changed. Walter picked up the red block. The truck just gave us the next question. Jake stared at the fresh tracks in the mud. Behind them, rain began falling harder. The first pull had not solved the recovery. It had done something more useful. It had exposed the problem. 6 inches was enough to change the mood, not enough to change the situation. The stranded truck had moved. Everyone had seen it. The buried rear tire had climbed slightly against the wall of mud, and the rear corner had rotated just enough to prove the old man had been right about one thing. The truck did not want to come out straight. The modern operator walked toward the rut. Well, he said, I'll give you that. The old man didn't answer. He was looking behind the diamond T. One rear tire had pressed deeper into the softened shoulder. Not much, but enough. The modern operator noticed it too. Your truck moved. The old man nodded. 1/2 inch. So I don't have 1/2 inch to give away every time I pull. The rain was getting heavier. Water ran in narrow streams down the road. The patch of ground that had looked firm 20 minutes earlier was changing under them. But now they knew the first movement worked. The operator pointed toward the stranded truck. Then do it again. The old man looked at the line. Then at the diamond T. He hesitated. Only for a second. That second would bother him later. He climbed back into the cab. The engine settled into its low rhythm. The line tightened again. This time the buried wheel started moving sooner. 3 inches. 4. The rear corner of the stranded truck rose slightly. Someone near the fence shouted, It's coming. The old man kept the pull slow. The truck moved another inch. Then stopped. He added just enough power to keep tension on the line. Nothing. The stranded truck held. The diamond T did not. Its rear tires slipped. Only a few inches. But once they broke traction, the movement came quickly. Mud rolled beneath the tread. The truck shifted sideways. The old man released the pull. Too late to hide what had happened. The diamond T had failed. The modern operator walked over with a look that was not quite a smile. Physics caught up with 1947. One of the younger men laughed. Quietly. The old man climbed down. He did not argue. He walked behind the diamond T and stared at the fresh tire marks, then back toward the stranded truck. The first pull had moved the load. The second had moved the recovery truck. Same engine. Same winch. Nearly the same line. But something had changed. The old man crouched and pressed his fingers into the road. Water had worked into the gravel. The surface that had held a few minutes earlier was becoming slick. He had solved one part of the problem and ignored another. His father would have hated that. The modern operator stood over him. So now what? The old man looked at the stranded truck, then at the diamond T, then at the 6 inches of fresh track cut into the mud. Now we stop pretending that was a failure. The operator frowned. You slid? I know. And the truck is still stuck. I know that too. Then what exactly did we learn? The old man stood. He pointed toward the stranded truck. Look at the rear wheel. The operator turned dull. For the first time, The buried tire was no longer facing the same way it had been when they started. The axle had rotated, the mud wall had cracked, and a narrow gap had opened behind the tire. The old man had lost traction, but the load had shown its hand. He looked at the modern operator. That 6 inches told us where it's willing to move. Then he pointed at the Diamond T's fresh tracks. And this told us where we're not allowed to pull from. The rain hammered harder against the steel body. The old man picked up the red Snatch block. The failure had cost them ground. But it had given him something more valuable. A map. The old man stood in the rain and looked at the 2 sets of marks, one from the stranded truck, one from the Diamond T. To everyone else, they were just tracks in the mud. To him, they were answers. The first mark showed where the load had agreed to move. The second showed where the recovery truck could no longer afford to stand. He walked back toward the buried rear wheel. The modern operator followed. "Show me." The old man pointed at the gap behind the tire. Before the first pull, that tire was locked against the wall. He crouched. Now it isn't. The mud had broken. Not completely, but enough to expose a narrow channel beneath the tread. The tire had rotated slightly uphill. The rear axle had shifted. The truck was no longer sitting exactly where the ditch had trapped it. The operator looked toward the road. "So we pull again from there?" "No." The answer came fast. The old man pointed at the Diamond T's tracks. "That's what this one told us." He walked back to the faded wrecker. Its rear tires had cut shallow grooves through the softened gravel. The top layer of the road had begun to shear away. Another hard pull from the same position would only turn the recovery truck into part of the problem. The operator nodded slowly. "So the load can move?" "Yes. But you can't pull from where you were." "Exactly." The old man looked toward the firmer ground, uphill. Then toward the cottonwood near the drainage cut. Then, back at the stranded truck. 3 points. 3 different relationships to the load. The operator saw his eyes moving between them. "You're changing the angle." The old man nodded. "I'm changing what the first few feet have to do." He picked up the stick again and drew in the mud. A rough rectangle for the truck. A line for the ditch. Another line for the road. Then he drew the direction of the first pull. Straight. That tried to drag everything at once. He drew a second line at an angle. This only needs to free the rear corner. Then another. After that, the rest of the truck becomes easier. The operator stared at the sketch. "So you're breaking one recovery into 2. Maybe 3. The younger man by the fence stepped closer. "You can't just make weight disappear." The old man looked up at him. "No." He tapped the drawing. "But you can stop fighting all of it at the same time." That was the part the 6 inches had revealed. The stranded truck had not behaved like one solid block. Its resistance came in layers. The buried tire. The axle. The downhill lean. The mud packed ahead of the tread. The weight transferred into the soft shoulder. Each one demanded something different. Trying to overcome them all with one straight pull had forced the wrecker to fight the truck, the ditch, and the road at once, but the first movement had separated them. Now the old man could see the sequence. First, rotate. Then, unload the buried corner. Then bring the truck forward. Not harder. In order. The modern operator looked at the red Snatch block in the old man's hand. "So that's what changes it." "Part of it. What's the rest?" The old man pointed toward the firmer section of road, where the truck stands, then toward the load, where the force enters, then toward the slope, and what we asked to move first. The operator was quiet. A few hours earlier, he would have answered the problem with horsepower. Now he was looking at geometry. The old man walked toward the Diamond T and began repositioning it. Not closer to the stranded truck. Farther away. That confused the men watching. If the recovery was already difficult, moving the wrecker farther from the load looked like the opposite of progress. But the old man wasn't trying to shorten the distance. He was trying to improve the line. The Diamond T rolled slowly onto firmer ground. Its rear tires settled onto gravel that had not yet turned to clay. The old man climbed down. He checked the ground again. Then the cable path. Then the stranded truck. The modern operator came up beside him. "You sure about this?" The old man looked at the 6-inch mark one final time. "No." The operator raised an eyebrow. The old man lifted the red block. "But now I know what I'm testing." Rain ran down the steel in thin streams. The crowd moved back. The Diamond T's engine settled into its slow rhythm. The line began to tighten. But this time, the cable wasn't asking the stranded truck to come straight home. It was asking for only one thing: move the trapped corner first. This pull sounded different. No sudden roar. No burst of throttle. No violent snap in the cable. The Diamond T simply settled against the load. Its engine dropped into a slow, heavy rhythm. The winch began turning, one measured revolution at a time. The red block took tension. The line changed direction. And for several seconds, nothing happened. The younger man near the fence glanced at the others. Maybe this was it. Maybe the old truck had finally reached the limit everyone expected it to reach. Then the buried rear tire moved. Not forward. Up. Barely an inch. But enough for a strip of muddy water to run underneath it. The old man saw it immediately. "Hold it there." The Diamond T stopped pulling. The modern operator looked at him. "Why stop now?" The old man pointed at the tire. "Because it gave us something." The mud wall that had been packed hard against the tread was beginning to collapse. Water seeped into the gap. The tire was no longer buried against one solid face of clay. The resistance had changed. The old man waited. 10 seconds. 20. Rainwater worked into the broken rut. Then he nodded. Again. The winch turned. Slowly. The tire climbed another inch. The rear corner of the stranded truck lifted just enough for the axle housing to clear the ridge that had been holding it. The truck rotated. Only slightly. But the movement changed everything. One of the men watching stepped forward. "It's turning." The old man didn't look away. "That's what we wanted." The modern operator studied the truck. The straight pull from earlier had tried to drag the entire load toward the road. This pull was doing something smaller. It was changing the position of the load first. The Diamond T was not winning a contest of strength. It was rearranging the problem. The old man gave another signal. The line tightened again. This time the buried tire rolled instead of pushing. A thick slab of mud broke away from the front of the tread. The rear axle shifted uphill. The truck moved nearly a foot. Someone cheered. The old man raised one hand. "Not yet." He released the tension again. The truck settled, but it did not fall back into the same hole. That mattered. The operator walked closer. "You've got it loose now. One corner. That's enough." "Isn't it?" The old man shook his head. "Enough to change the next pull." He pointed toward the front axle. The weight distribution had changed. With the rear corner higher, the truck sat less sharply toward the ravine. The cable angle that had made sense 30 seconds earlier was already becoming less useful. The modern operator stared at him. "You're going to change it again?" "I'd better." "But it's working." The old man looked at him. "That's when you pay attention most." The answer stayed with the operator. Success could hide a mistake just as easily as failure. The old man stepped back and looked at the entire scene again. Diamond T. Stranded truck. Road. Slope. Cable. The first layer of resistance was gone. Now the job was different. He adjusted the recovery path. Not to pull harder, to follow what the truck had just shown them. When the winch began turning again, the movement was smoother. The stranded truck came around another few degrees. The driver's side rear tire found firmer ground. The passenger side climbed out of the deepest section of the rut. For the first time all afternoon, the truck looked less like something trapped in a ditch and more like something that could actually be driven back toward the road. The crowd stopped talking. All they could hear was rain on steel, the low engine note, the metallic rhythm of the winch, and the occasional crack of mud releasing its grip. The old Diamond T never looked powerful. That was the strange part. It looked patient. Every few inches. The old man paused, watched, adjusted, let the load settle, then asked for another small movement. 6 inches. 10. A foot. Each one removed something. The next pull would no longer have to fight. The modern operator finally understood what he had been watching. The old man wasn't pulling one heavy truck out of one deep ditch. He was turning one impossible pull into a series of smaller possible ones. The Diamond T moved the rear corner, then the axle, then the center of the load, then the truck itself, in that order, and suddenly, the modern wrecker's first attempt looked very different. It had tried to skip straight to the last step. The old man released the winch again. The stranded truck was now several feet from where it had started. Its rear wheels stood higher. Its cab sat closer to level. But there was still one dangerous section between it and the road. Soft ground, a sharper incline, and more weight than the Diamond T could safely control alone. The modern operator looked at the old man. For the first time, there was no challenge in his voice. "What do you need?" The old man looked at the modern wrecker, then at its hydraulic boom, its weight, its braking capacity, its controls, all the things he had never claimed the Diamond T could match. He pointed toward the road. "Now I need your truck." The operator looked surprised. "I thought the old one was proving a point." The old man shook his head. "It already did." "What point?" He looked at the stranded truck, now sitting at a completely different angle than before. "That power works a lot better after the problem stops fighting it." Then he pointed toward the modern wrecker. "And now that we've changed the problem," he paused, "we can finally use all that power you brought." The modern operator looked at his truck differently now. An hour earlier, it had been the obvious answer. More engine, more winch, more machine. Now the old man was asking him to use all of that power only after the hardest part of the problem had changed. The stranded truck was no longer buried deep in the same rut. Its rear corner had been rotated uphill. One tire had found firmer ground. The axle was no longer locked against the clay wall. What remained was still heavy, still dangerous. But it was no longer fighting in three directions at once. The old man pointed toward the modern wrecker. "Bring it up 10 feet. The operator hesitated. "Straight? No." The old man walked toward the road and pointed to a new position. "Here." The operator followed the line with his eyes. From there, his truck would not be pulling directly against the ditch. It would be helping guide the stranded truck through the angle the Diamond T had already created. He climbed into the cab. The big diesel came alive. This time, nobody cheered at the sound. Power no longer impressed them by itself. The wrecker rolled forward and stopped where the old man had indicated. The operator climbed down. Now what? The old man looked at both machines. The Diamond T sat on firmer ground with its line still controlling the rear of the load. The modern wrecker now had the better position for the final movement. For the first time, the two trucks were not trying to solve the same problem. They had different jobs. The old man pointed to the Diamond T. "I keep the rear from falling back." Then to the modern wrecker. "You bring the front around and take the weight when it climbs." The operator nodded. "So we're sharing the load. We're sharing the work." That distinction mattered. The Diamond T did not need to become stronger. The modern wrecker did not need to become smarter. Each machine only needed to do the job it was best positioned to do. They reset. The rain had eased slightly, but the road had not improved. Water still ran through the ruts. Mud still clung to the tires. The ravine was still only a few feet away. The old man climbed into the Diamond T. The modern operator returned to his controls. They looked at each other. One nod. That was enough. The modern winch took tension first. The stranded truck shifted. The Diamond T answered, holding the rear corner steady. For the first time all afternoon, the load moved without twisting toward the ravine. A foot, then another. The modern operator eased off. The old man held. The truck settled. Stable. Again. The old man called. The modern wrecker pulled. This time the front axle climbed toward the crown of the road. The Diamond T kept the rear from sliding downhill. The stranded truck rotated smoothly between them. No sudden lurch. No shower of mud. No screaming engine. Just controlled movement. The younger man by the fence stared at the two wreckers. So which one's doing the real work? The old man heard him. He almost smiled. That question had been the problem from the beginning. Everyone wanted one winner. One stronger truck. One machine that could claim the recovery. But recovery did not care about pride. The old man called across to the modern operator, "Hold there." The operator stopped immediately. An hour earlier, he might have questioned him. Now he only asked, "What do you see?" The old man climbed down and checked the rear wheel. It was almost clear. Another few feet and the stranded truck would be back on solid road. He looked at the modern operator. "You know, I never said your truck was too new." The operator laughed. "You didn't have to." The old man shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the first set of deep tire marks the modern wrecker had made earlier. "I said we were asking it to pull the wrong way." The operator looked at those tracks for a long moment, then at the Diamond T, then at his own machine. For the first time, the difference between the two trucks no longer looked like 79 years of technology. It looked like two different kinds of knowledge. One machine carried decades of engineering progress. The other carried decades of experience about where force should go. And now, working together, they had one final pull left. The final pull began without anyone saying much. The Diamond T held the rear. The modern wrecker took the front. Between them, the stranded truck sat at the last bad angle. Its rear tires were almost clear. Its front axle was close to the crown of the road. Another few feet would decide whether the recovery was finished or whether the whole load settled back into the mud. The old man looked across the rain-darkened road. The modern operator met his eyes. One nod. The winches took tension. Slowly, the modern wrecker began to pull. The stranded truck moved forward. The Diamond T held the rear from slipping downhill. For the first time, there was no sideways twist, no sudden drop, no wheel digging deeper. The load simply moved. A foot, then another. The passenger side rear tire climbed out of the rut. Mud peeled away from the tread in thick slabs. Someone near the fence shouted. Nobody else joined him. Not yet. The modern operator kept the pull steady. The old man watched the rear axle. Another foot. The tire reached gravel. The truck's body shifted, then leveled. The worst of the weight came off the soft shoulder. The old man raised his hand. Hold. Both winches stopped. The stranded truck sat still, completely still. No movement toward the ravine. No tires sinking. Nothing but rainwater running beneath the chassis. The operator looked across. Clear? The old man walked around the rear. He checked the ground, looked at the axle, then pressed his boot against the gravel. Firm. He stepped back. Bring it home. The final movement almost looked easy. That was the strange part. The modern wrecker pulled. The Diamond T maintained control. The stranded truck rolled the last few feet onto the center of the road. Then both winches went quiet. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The machine that had looked impossible to recover less than an hour earlier now sat upright on the road. Mud dripping from the tires. Cab level. Ravine behind it. Safe. The young man who had laughed when the Diamond T arrived stared at the old truck. Its engine was still idling. Nothing about it looked triumphant. Faded paint. Dented steel. Water running from the hood. The red Snatch block hung motionless in the line. The modern operator walked toward the old man. He looked at the Diamond T, then at his own wrecker, then back again. How much horsepower does that thing make? The old man smiled. He had been asked that question before, a long time ago. He reached down and disconnected the red block. The steel was warm in his hands. Enough. The operator laughed, not because the answer was funny, because now he understood it. The old man carried the block back toward the toolbox. Behind him, the modern wrecker stood taller, stronger, and more capable in almost every measurable way. And none of that had been wrong. The mistake had been believing those measurements were the whole problem. The old man set the block inside the box. The younger man by the fence finally spoke. So the old truck won? The old man looked at him. No. He glanced back at the road, at the tracks, at the two wreckers, at the truck they had just recovered. We stopped trying to win. Then he closed the toolbox. And that was the moment the crowd stopped seeing the Diamond T as an old truck that had somehow beaten a newer one. They began seeing what the old man had seen from the beginning. Power had never been the question. By the time the last cable was coiled, the rain had almost stopped. Miller Creek Road looked wounded. Deep tracks cut through the shoulder. Mud covered both wreckers. Water still ran toward the washout in thin brown streams. But the stranded truck was back on gravel. Upright. Safe. Its engine idled as if none of the afternoon had happened. Jake stood beside the Diamond T, while Walter packed away the last of the gear. Up close. The old truck looked every year of its age. Cracked paint. Worn handles. A dented fender. Steel polished smooth, where the same hands had touched it for decades. There was nothing magical about it. Jake looked toward his own wrecker. Bigger. Stronger. Better brakes. Better controls. More winch. More machine in almost every measurable way. You know, he said, if I had to choose one truck for 100 recoveries, Walter closed one compartment. You'd choose yours. Jake smiled. Yeah. So would I. That caught him off guard. Jake looked at the Diamond T. Then why keep this one? Walter stopped. For a moment, his hand stayed on the toolbox latch. He had been asked that question before. Collectors had asked it. Neighbors had asked it. Even Walter had asked himself. For years, he had given easy answers. Still runs. Still works. Still useful. All of them were true. None of them were the whole truth. Walter opened the toolbox again. The red Snatch block lay on top of the chain. Scarred steel. Faded paint. One edge worn smooth by years of use. He lifted it. When I was 16, I thought this was just something my father used because he didn't have better equipment. Jake leaned against the running board. Walter turned the block in his hands. I thought the same thing about the truck. He smiled faintly. Old engine. Old winch. Old ways. Jake said nothing. Walter looked across the road. For a second, he could see Harold standing there. Not clearly. Time had taken too much for that. Walter could no longer remember the exact sound of his father's laugh. Some days he could not picture his face without looking at a photograph, but he remembered his hands. The way Harold touched a cable before trusting it. The way he crouched beside a tire and studied the ground. The way he would stand still while everyone else was already reaching for more power. Walter looked down at the block. After he died, I left this truck in the barn for almost a month. Jake watched him. I'd open the door sometimes. Walter rested one hand on the old steering wheel. Couldn't start it. Why? Walter looked through the windshield. Because the cab still felt like his. The words surprised even him. He had never said them aloud. Not like that. Jake lowered his eyes. Walter continued. I thought if I kept the truck running, I could keep some part of him from disappearing. He looked at the worn dashboard. The smell. The tools. The way the gearbox sounded. The places his hands had worn smooth. For a long time, I thought that was what I was saving. Jake looked at the red block. And now? Walter glanced toward the torn-up shoulder. At the first deep marks Jake's wrecker had made, at the curved tracks left by the stranded truck as its rear corner finally came free, at the place where the Diamond T had slipped and forced Walter to rethink the pull. Then he looked at Jake. Now I think I had it backward. Jake frowned. Walter set the block on the running board between them. My father isn't in this truck. He tapped the old steel lightly. He isn't in this either. The wind moved through the wet trees. Walter looked toward the recovered hauler. He's in the question I still ask before I pull. Jake was quiet. Walter continued. What's actually holding it? A pause. What can move first? Another. Where should the force go? Jake looked back toward his wrecker. An hour earlier, those questions would have sounded too simple. Now he understood how expensive it could be not to ask them. So that's what today was? Walter smiled. What? You teaching me your father's trick? Walter shook his head. No trick. He picked up the block. Tricks make people think they can copy the last answer. Then he pointed toward the torn road. Next ditch won't look like this one. Next truck won't sit the same. Next ground won't fail the same way. Jake nodded slowly. So I'm supposed to remember the questions. Walter looked at him. Now you're getting somewhere. Jake laughed. Walter placed the red block back inside the toolbox. This time, when he closed the lid, the sound felt different. For years, he had treated the truck like a container for memory, something that had to survive, so Harold would survive with it. But the lesson had already left the toolbox. It had crossed the road. It had entered another man, and for the first time, Walter understood that passing something on did not make it smaller. It made losing it harder. Jake looked at the Diamond T one last time. So the old ways really aren't better? Walter climbed into the cab. No. He started the engine. The old motor turned slowly, caught, and settled into its familiar, uneven rhythm. Walter rolled down the window. New tools are better. He nodded toward Jake's wrecker. That truck can do things this one never could. Jake rested a hand on his door. But Walter looked toward the recovered hauler. But new tools don't make old questions obsolete. He eased the Diamond T into gear, then stopped. Jake looked up. Walter pointed toward the first scars in the road. Next time something won't move, don't start by asking how much your truck can pull. Jake nodded. Ask what the load needs to do first. Walter smiled. That'll do. The Diamond T rolled away. Slow. Noisy. Outdated. Its faded red body disappeared around the same bend it had come through less than an hour earlier. Jake remained beside the modern wrecker. For a long time, he watched the road after Walter was gone. Then he looked at the mud. Not at his winch. Not at the engine. At the mud. And somewhere inside the old Diamond T, a scarred red block rested quietly in a steel toolbox. It had not made the old truck stronger. It had never needed to. The modern wrecker had brought the power. Walter had brought the questions. And 60 years after Harold Hayes first taught them to his son, someone else finally knew to ask them,